So here, Trump administration has raised tariffs on imports from all countries based on the level of trading relationships with the US. So the tariffs faced by the US is calculated on the basis of the trade deficit with the trading partner as a percentage of total imports into the US from the trading partner. Now, if the trade is heavily in favor of the trading partner, such as trade deficit, this is accompanied by lower levels of imports, then you will see that the tariffs are higher for that trading partner. Therefore, trading partners which have a high trade surplus, which is primarily driven by their exports to the US, will face higher tariffs than partners which run a high trade deficit or a near balanced trade with the US. Now, Pakistan has a trade surplus with the US of 3.1 billion, and the US imports 5.2 billion from Pakistan, which is roughly leads to tariffs to the US economy of about 60% or 58% that has been imposed by the US. Okay, so thank you first of all for the invitation to talk to you on this important topic. So here, Trump administration has raised tariffs on imports from all countries based on the level of trading relationships with the US. So the tariffs faced by the US is calculated on the basis of the trade deficit with the trading partner as a percentage of total imports into the US from the trading partner. Now, if the trading partner is heavily in favor of if the trade is heavily in favor of the trading partner, such as that has a high trade deficit, this is accompanied by lower levels of imports, then you will see that the tariffs are higher for that trading partner. Therefore, trading partners which have a high trade surplus, which is primarily driven by their exports to the US, will face higher tariffs than partners which run a high trade deficit or a near balanced trade with the US. Now, Pakistan has a trade surplus with the US of 3.1 billion, and the US imports 5.2 billion from Pakistan, which is roughly leads to tariffs to the US economy of about 60% or 58% that has been imposed by the US. And another important thing here I want to mention is that about 3/4 of the exports to the US are of textile products. Therefore, either Pakistan should find a way to shrink its exports to the US, which will be the case if exporters find the tariffs burdensome, or reduce the trade surplus by importing more from the US. The second option, I believe, needs to be explored, as Pakistan has to find ways to increase its overall exports, but at the same time increase access into its most important market. In a sense, Trump administration has tied exports from its trading partners to the amount the trading partner imports from the US. So there's a two-way relationship in this, and I guess that is what Trump is trying to exploit. So what we say is that the short-run impact will increase the challenges that exporters face, rising costs to service the most important export destination. The immediate effect will be on the exporters to the US as they struggle to determine the best possible price given the tariff rates. It is likely that the demand for foreign goods, particularly products aimed at the lower socio-economic strata that are typically exported from Pakistan, is likely to fall. Pakistani textile exporters, like elsewhere, will have to brace for some impact. However, certain products may not have readily available substitutes in the US domestic market, and the demand for such products may not be as affected as demand for products that are more sensitive to price changes. But here I want to also say that although this is not a point under consideration today, there is no discussion on services exports yet. And US has a significant surplus on its service exports of about $280 billion. So it could be possible that countries do retaliate in the services sector, which we haven't really heard about. And this can create potential opportunities for Pakistan as well, especially given that its exports from the IT sector is increasing. So again, a major item now that stands out for Pakistan is the amount of US cotton Pakistan has imported in the last few years. So exports of cotton from the US increased from about $300 million in 2015 to more than $1 billion in 2022. This particular increase was due to the change in the source from India to the US. So this has decreased to about $770 million in 2024. Now, Pakistan is the second largest importer of US cotton in the world after China, while exports to China was about $1.5 billion in 2024. If you look at the exports to Vietnam of cotton, that was about $580 million, and exports to Bangladesh was $250 million. However, Pakistan primarily relies on US cotton, imports of US cotton, while US exporters face stiffer competition from other suppliers in the other markets. So here it is also important to note that raw cotton constitutes as the single most important products in terms of its exports of textile products from the US. So that's why this will hold a lot of importance for the US policymakers as well. So therefore, entering into greater production chains involving US cotton producers must be considered by the textile producers if Pakistan is to seek lower tariff rates on its exports to the US. Pakistan can negotiate tariff concessions on products that use US inputs from source from the US. So the overall trade balance can be impacted if exports fall as is predicted in a worst case scenario. The economic outlook can also take a hit as the textile industry has a high weightage in the manufacturing sector for Pakistan, right? So the reduction in export growth during the IMF program can exacerbate the economic conditions. However, it is important to know that other countries will also go through a similar crisis period as their exports too will take a hit. So the short-term predictions on the export earnings will need to be revised downward in this case. I do not think subsidies is the answer to the dilemma being faced by the exporting countries. First, the government will have their hands tied due to the fiscal challenges they face. Negotiations with the IMF are unlikely to bear fruit, and especially they are going to be very tough because given the conditions that the IMF may impose. And further, other countries are likely to be more aggressive with their subsidies and support to their exporters, which will further reduce the ability to compete for Pakistani exporters, given that our subsidies tend to be highly targeted and limited in scope. The Pakistani exporters may have to consider ways to negotiate lower tariffs by increasing the content of US inputs in their products. Contracts involving such production methods may be more useful as tariff concessions are more essential than subsidies in this case. It is also important for exporters to not only diversify their exports by increasing the presence in the EU market, but also they need to introduce and diversify the product and the quality ranges. For instance, some exporters may find competing with higher valued products more lucrative than lower valued products, especially in the US market, given that the scope and the ability to compete will change. So Pakistan has not only low value of imports, but imports are concentrated mainly in raw cotton and waste scraps of iron and steel from the US, right? So both are likely to be used as upstream products demanded by manufacturers in their respective industries. Retaliatory tariffs are unlikely to serve its purpose as it may hurt our own businesses more, particularly those demanding the inputs from the US. Also, the tariffs are structured in such a way that the drive for higher exports without the compensating imports are likely to increase pressure on the tariffs rather than reduce them. As the calculation that is provided by the US, the way it is structured, it seems that it will be difficult to increase exports without increasing imports in this sense from the US. So Pakistani businesses exporting to the US will need to discover ways to participate in the US production and value chains rather than shun such options. And I guess this is where it's going to become critically important, is how the businesses adapt to these challenges that are thrown by these new tariffs. So again, the question here is that basically about trade and industrial policies, we need to look at value chains, and they're likely to become more increasingly important for a country like Pakistan that does not have the local capacities to produce several of its products. It does not have the inputs nor some of the resources available to produce to have all the production processes within the country. So Pakistani producers may have to develop value chains for the US market and other markets differently, or start relying more on US imports to produce their goods for other markets as well, particularly if it wants to increase its exports to the US and use tariff concessions from the US as an attractive tool to achieve the purpose. The idea should be to reduce the trade surplus with the US, but increase it with other countries. I feel that there will be a scramble to attract not only US consumers, as is traditionally the case for the textile exporters, but also to attract sourcing companies that can attain US inputs at competitive prices. So as the US forcefully attempts to reduce its trade deficit, the competitive pressure on all exporters will increase with new sourcing and selling strategies in this case.